So in this screencast, we're going to consider the third of our determinants of demand, which is the price of other goods. And in this short screencast, we're going to consider the concept of substitutes and complements. So, the demand for goods is affected by changes in the price of closely related goods. And this leads us on to the concept of substitutes and complements. Now, for substitutes, these are said to occur when an increase in the price of one results in an increase in demand for the other. So what examples have we considered? Well, an increase in the price of one sporting activity might lead to people substituting their demand for another activity. So we've talked about how budget gyms are a substitute and a very close substitute for mid-market gyms. And when in international sports strategy, I talked to you about business models and the decline of mid-market gyms like Fitness First and Holmes Place, and the rise of budget gyms like Pure Gym and The Gym, we can see that the price of mid-market gyms was seen as too high by consumers, and they simply increased their demand for budget gyms, which were a slightly different proposition in the marketplace, because the price of budget gyms was much lower and it was available and attractive substitute. So substitutes do occur in our industry. I also have to say that for some aspects of our business, there don't appear to be many close substitutes. And an example, the classical example, I suppose, is football teams, where there seems to be a relatively low substitution effect, where prices are increasing. We don't see ticket prices increasing for a football team, leading to supporters of that football team switching their allegiance to another football team. It doesn't really happen, because loyalty is more important. And if we look at Porter's five forces, again, which is closely related to this economic concept of substitutes, we see that where brand loyalty is strong, that the threat of substitutes is diminished. And we can see that, in some areas of the sport industry, and in particular in the area of supporting a team, that brand loyalty trumps, other factors, and that substitutes are often not available where someone has got a very high brand loyalty. So that kind of covers the area of substitutes. Complements are goods which tend to be bought together. So a classic example from textbooks is gin and tonic. So 10 years ago, I would say that gin was not that fashionable a drink now. Gin is much more of a fashionable drink now than it was a decade ago. And this has led to a rise probably in the demand for tonic, gin and tonic, goods which are bought together. Fish and chips is another example from England. So this is a kind of, these are kind of complements, goods which tend to be bought together. Now, let's think about this. So goods which tend to be bought together would be, bookings for squash courts would lead to a rise in the purchase of squash rackets. Yeah. So a racket sport is one where, increase in demand for squash leads to an increase in demand for squash rackets and squash balls. And complements are affected because they are so closely associated, to the extent that when you have a decrease in the price of one, this leads to an increase in the demand for both. So, for example, using our squash courts analogy or squash analogy, if the price of squash club membership was decreased, in theory, this could make the sport more attractive and lead to increased participation, more people taking part in sport, which would lead to an increase in the demand for squash rackets. Yeah, and equally, if the price of squash court bookings increased, yeah, this could lead to a decrease in demand for squash club membership and therefore a decrease in the demand for squash rackets. Yeah? And when we look at the price of other goods, what we are looking at in economic terms is the responsiveness of quantity demanded for one good to the price of another. And this is called cross-price elasticity of demand. So cross-price elasticity of demand is similar to income elasticity and price elasticity. It's the change in quantity demanded for one good as the result of a 1% change in the price of another. Now, what we can see is that complements have a value of less than 1 and substitutes have a value of complements have a value of less than 0 and substitutes have a value of more than 0, right? So complements have a kind of negative cross-price elasticity because an increase in the price of one will lead to a decrease in the demand for both. Substitutes have a positive cross-price elasticity because an increase in the price of one leads to an increase in the demand for the substitute. Okay, and where cross-price elasticity is 0, i.e. there doesn't appear to be any change in demand for one product as price changes for the other product, then there is no relationship. So it's a nice idea, but Grattan and Taylor say that there is very little empirical evidence for cross-price elasticity for sports products and services. So there is difficulties in identifying substitutes and complements. So the lack of empirical evidence doesn't mean that, it's not a valuable concept. And certainly in strategic management of sport, when we talk about Porter's 5 forces and the threat of substitutes, the concept is useful. It's just empirical evidence in economic terms is lacking. So just to show you a little bit more about substitutes, we can categorize substitutes as close substitutes and weak substitutes. So close substitutes are very closely associated with the activity or the product or service, and they are so closely associated that a small rise in the price of X or one product causes a large rise in demand for Y. So X in our case could be the mid-market gyms and Y could be the budget gyms, and a small increase in price for mid-market gyms has led to mass exodus from mid-market gyms to budget gyms. Yeah. So, and this is behind the growth of demand and the growth of the size of the budget gym industry in this country, because it is a very close substitute. Okay. We have others as well, which could be seen to be weak substitutes. So weak substitutes are where there is some increase in demand as a result in the increase of price in one good, where there is an increase where there is an increase in price of one good, there is an increase in demand for another substitute good, but it's only a small increase. So this chart here on the right hand side indicates that. So for budget gyms, we can say that there is some evidence that they are a kind of close substitute for kind of premium and mid-market gyms. Weak substitutes, we don't really have, or I can't think of a very good example to show you this, but this could be, you know, it could be, for example, that an increase in the price of gyms could lead to an increase in the price of gyms could lead to an increase in the demand for racket sports as people look for another sport to do, which is less expensive, or an increase in running, or an increase in online exercise classes. But as we've said previously, there is relatively little empirical evidence to support this theory. So it's a theory, but it's a theory which requires more evidence before we can talk about, you know, the availability and the effect of the availability of substitutes and the effect of cross-price elasticity of demand in the sport market for a range of products. Okay, so the final thing I want to talk to you about in the neoclassical determinants of demand models are tastes and preferences, which is going to be the subject of Screencast 5.